Elderly couple finds gagged newborn in garden. Her arrival hides a shocking secret. The early morning light bathed the Larson farm in a soft, golden glow. Nestled near the quiet village of Skovjeg, the farm was surrounded by rolling hills and dense birch forests. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air, mingling with the warmth of freshly baked rug broad drifting from the kitchen window. Birds chirped noisily from the fence posts, their calls blending with the distant hum of sheep grazing in the fields. Henrik Larson, his hands rough and calloused from decades of working the land, wiped the sweat from his brow as he straightened up from attending the vegetable patch. At 62, Henrik still moved with the steady rhythm of a man who had spent his life outdoors. A few feet away, his wife, Ingrid Larson, stood on the porch, watching the world wake up with a quiet satisfaction. Life in this remote corner of Jutland had always been predictable: work, weather, and time. Everything about the morning seemed normal until Henrik saw it. Near the wooden fence, where the ground sloped into scattered brush, something moved, a dark bundle, small and unnatural, twitching among the leaves. His stomach turned. Animals didn't leave bundles behind. "Ingrid?" he called, his voice low, uncertain. From the porch, Ingrid looked up, one hand brushing against the wrinkles in her apron. "What is it?" Henrik didn't answer right away. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the dry grass. Ingrid hurried toward him, her heart already pounding. The bundle stirred. A child's whimper cut through the air, faint, weak. Ingrid dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached out. The rough fabric of the bundle felt damp and cold beneath her fingers. Slowly she pulled the cloth away, her breath caught. A baby girl. Her cheeks flushed, her tiny fists trembling against the frayed blanket. But what sent a sharp chill through Ingrid's bones was the gag stuffed into her mouth. Tear tracks streaked her pale skin. Her eyes were swollen from crying, perhaps for hours, perhaps all night. No sounds had come, as if she had learned that no one would come for her. Ingrid snatched the gag away, lifting the child to her chest. The baby gasped, sucking in shaky breaths, but still didn't cry. Her little body pressed against Ingrid's warmth, tense, unsure. Henrik knelt beside them, his hands hovering uselessly. His mind reeled. Who would do this? Who would abandon a child, and worse, silence her? Then he saw something glinting against the baby's skin. A gold chain looped around her small neck, partially hidden beneath the folds of the blanket. Henry carefully lifted the pendant. The shape was simple, a house, and on the back, an engraving. Nielsen. Nielsen, Henrik muttered under his breath. The name meant nothing to him, but it had clearly meant something to someone. Ingrid clutched the baby tightly, pressing her lips against the child's forehead. "We need to get inside." Inside the farmhouse, warmth greeted them. The scent of fresh bread, the lingering smoke from the morning fire. Ingrid didn't hesitate. She sat down at the kitchen table, rocking the baby gently. Henrik lit the stove, warming water in an old kettle. "She's freezing," Ingrid murmured, brushing a hand along the baby's arm. The child had stopped trembling, her small fingers now curled into the fabric of Ingrid's dress. Henrik stepped back, rubbing his temples. His world had been built on soil, cattle, and harvest seasons. Now a child had appeared, alone, gagged, wearing a necklace with a name he didn't recognize. Whoever did this, they didn't just abandon her. Henrik's voice was firm, edged with anger, his fingers curled into fists. They wanted her to be speechless. The wind outside howled against the windows. Rain began to lash against the roof, the sound heavy and unrelenting. The storm mirrored the turmoil brewing inside the farmhouse. Ingrid adjusted the blanket around the baby, and her voice softer when she spoke again. Maybe she's here for a reason. Henrik turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying?" Ingrid met his gaze, the shadows from the firelight flickering in her eyes. "Maybe we're meant to take care of her." For a moment, Henrik said nothing. He looked back down at the pendant in his hand, running his thumb over the engraving. Nielsen. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know where she had come from. But she was here, and they couldn't turn their backs on that. Days later, a stranger arrived at the Larson farm. Tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying an air of authority, he introduced himself as Victor Nielsen, a wealthy businessman from Copenhagen. When he showed them a photograph of the same baby girl cradled in Ingrid's arms, the couple realized the mystery was far from over, and much darker than they could have imagined. By the time Henrik returned to the farmhouse, the weight of what he had just done pressed heavily on his chest. His boots were caked with mud, his hands rough with dirt from the burial, the house warm and filled with the scent of freshly baked rug-brod rye bread, felt like a world apart from the cold, damp grave he had just left behind. Ingrid was at the kitchen table, rocking the baby gently in her arms. She looked up the moment he entered, her gaze searching. She could tell something was wrong before he even spoke. Henrik exhaled slowly, setting his hat down. "I found a woman," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Ingrid stilled. "A woman?" "In the forest," Henrik continued, rubbing his hands together as if trying to rid them of something invisible. "She was dead, Ingrid. Stabbed right through the heart." The room seemed to shrink with the weight of his words. Henrik sat down across from her, his elbows resting on the worn wooden table. "She had a bracelet, just like the baby's pendant." Ingrid's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Instead, she pulled the baby closer, her arms tightening protectively around the small, sleeping form. After a long pause, she murmured, "We need to call the police." Henrik nodded. He had already thought the same. An hour later, he stood by the old landline, listening as the local sheriff sighed on the other end. "We'll send someone to take a look," the man said, his tone laced with doubt. "But I'll be honest with you, Henrik. This village is too far out. If no one has reported a missing person, we might never get answers, especially after a storm. Many traces may have been erased." Henrik clenched his jaw. They had to try. Because now, more than ever, it was clear that someone had wanted this woman to disappear. 1 month later. The autumn air had grown crisper, the leaves on the old birch tree outside the Larson farmhouse turning a deep amber. 1 month had passed since the night Henrik and Ingrid found the baby near the fence. The days had fallen into a strange, new rhythm, one neither of them had expected, but had embraced nonetheless. Their once a quiet home was now filled with the soft sounds of infancy, the rustle of tiny movements, the occasional gurgle, the rhythmic pattern of breathing as she slept. And somewhere along the way, Ingrid had begun calling her Era. "It suits her," she had said one evening, stroking the child's fine blonde hair. "She needs a name, Henrik. We can't just keep calling her the baby." Henrik had only nodded, watching as Era curled her tiny fingers around Ingrid's thumb, her grip surprisingly strong. Now, a month later, Era had grown stronger. The fever had faded, her once fragile limbs filling out with the warmth of steady meals and care. Her eyes, once dull with exhaustion, now followed Ingrid with quiet curiosity. She had settled into their lives so naturally that Henrik sometimes forgot just how she had come to them. Left out in the cold, gagged, wearing that golden pendant with the word Nielsen engraved on it. But Henrik never forgot for long. The stranger arrives. It was late afternoon when a sleek black car rolled down the dirt path leading to the Larson farm. Henrik was outside splitting firewood when he saw it approach. The vehicle looked entirely out of place against the rustic backdrop of the fields and barns. As it came to a stop, a tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out. His sharp suit and polished shoes screamed wealth, a stark contrast to Henrik's weathered flannel shirt and muddy boots. "Good day," the man said, his voice smooth and confident. "Are you Henrik Larson?" Henrik straightened, gripping the axe tightly. "Yes. Who's asking?" The man smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "My name is Victor Nielsen. I believe you've recently come into possession of something that belongs to me." Henrik's stomach tightened. "And what would that be?" Victor's gaze shifted toward the farmhouse where Ingrid stood in the doorway, Era cradled in her arms. "The child," he said simply. "Her name is Era Nielsen. She is my granddaughter." Ingrid gasped softly, clutching Era closer. Henrik stepped forward, placing himself between Victor and his family. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" he demanded. Victor reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. He held it up for Henrik to see. It showed a young woman holding a baby, Era. The resemblance was undeniable. "That's her mother," Victor explained. "My daughter, Astrid. She disappeared weeks ago under unfortunate circumstances. When I heard about a baby being found in this area, I knew it had to be her." Henrik exchanged a glance with Ingrid. There was no denying the connection. But something about Victor's demeanor set off warning bells. "Why was she abandoned?" Henrik asked sharply. "And who killed the woman we found in the woods?" Victor's expression darkened. "Those are questions I intend to answer. But first, I need my granddaughter back." A tense standoff. Inside the farmhouse, the tension was palpable. Victor sat stiffly at the kitchen table, his polished shoes gleaming even in the dim light. Ingrid paced nervously. Era clutched protectively in her arms. Henrik leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, studying Victor carefully. "You must understand," Victor said, his tone calm but firm. "Era is all I have left of my daughter. I will do whatever it takes to ensure her safety." "And what about the woman in the woods?" Henrik countered. "The one wearing a bracelet identical to Era's pendant. Was that your daughter?" Victor hesitated, his jaw tightening. "No, that was someone else. Someone involved in Astrid's disappearance. Believe me, Henrik, I want justice for my daughter as much as you do. But Era belongs with me." Ingrid finally spoke, her voice trembling. "She's ours now. We've cared for her, loved her. Can't just walk in here and take her away." Victor's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "I don't wish to cause you pain, but Era deserves to grow up knowing her family, to inherit what is rightfully hers. My estate, my legacy, it's all waiting for her." Henrik stepped forward, his voice steely. "If you truly care about Era, prove it. Stay here. Let us see that you're worthy of her trust. Then, and only then, will we consider letting her go." Victor studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Very well. I'll stay for now." The cold had settled deeper into the land, the kind that lingered long after the sun had risen. The amber leaves of the birch trees outside the Larson farmhouse fluttered restlessly in the early autumn wind, some breaking free and drifting to the ground in slow, spiraling motions. It had been weeks since Henrik and Ingrid found Era. The rhythm of their lives had shifted, molded itself around the baby in ways neither of them had expected. Ingrid, always steady in her ways, had taken to caring for Era as if she had been born to it. The baby grew stronger by the day, her fever long gone, her small frame filling out with warmth and nourishment. She had begun to follow movements with wide, searching eyes, to grasp Ingrid's fingers and not let go. Henrik watched, but rarely spoke about it. His thoughts were tangled with question, and some of which he wasn't ready to voice aloud. And yet, for all the changes inside their home, the outside world had remained silent. No reports of a missing baby. No mother searching for her lost child. No explanation for the woman buried beneath the hill. Until the stranger arrived. The general store in Scauvier was always a quiet place, a small, simple building near the village's main road, where neighbors exchanged conversation as easily as they exchanged goods. That morning, however, the mood shifted. A man stepped inside, tall and well-dressed, but with a weariness that clung to him like an old grief. His hair was slightly unkempt, his face gaunt, as if sleep had become a distant memory. He carried himself with the stiffness of someone who had been walking too long without knowing where he was going. When he reached the counter, the shopkeeper hesitated, eyeing the man carefully. "Something I can help you with, sir." The man swallowed before pulling a folded photograph from his coat. He held it out, his fingers visibly unsteady. "I'm looking for my wife," he said, his voice rough and worn, "and my child." The shopkeeper took the photo, frowning. A woman with dark hair, a baby in her arms, a happy moment frozen in time. But something about the image made the shopkeeper's throat tighten. "I don't know her," he said slowly. Then, hesitating, he added, "But you might want to speak with Henrik Larsen. He's out by his farm." Henrik had been splitting wood when he heard footsteps approaching. He wiped the sweat from his brow, turning, only to freeze at the sight of the man standing before him. The stranger stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he simply looked at Henrik, studying him as if searching for something unspoken in the lines of his face. Then he reached into his coat, pulled out the photograph, and held it up. "This is my wife, Astrid," he said, his voice hollow, "and my daughter." Henrik's world tilted. His grip tightened around the axe handle, the weight of reality crashing down on him all at once. His eyes locked onto the image. It was her, the woman he had buried. He felt something deep inside him, a sickness, a grief that wasn't his own, but suddenly became unbearable. The man, Christian Nielsen, as he later introduced himself, was still speaking, his words unraveling in hurried desperation. "They've been missing," he said, his hands shaking now. "I was overseas for work. When I came back, they were gone. No sign of them anywhere. I've been searching for weeks." His breath hitched. "Please, have you seen them?" Henry couldn't answer. "Not yet." Instead, he turned and began walking. Christian hesitated, then followed. They left the farmhouse behind, stepping into the cool, silent air of the hills, until they reached the grave. Henrik stopped at the simple wooden cross. He didn't need to say a word. Christian knew. For a long, stretched moment, he just stared, as if his mind refused to process what was in front of him, as if by standing there long enough, the truth might somehow change. Then, with a sharp breath, his knees buckled. The photograph slipped from his fingers, landing in the dirt. His hands trembled as they curled into fists. Tears streamed down his face, silent and devastating. "Who did this?" Christian whispered finally, his voice breaking. "Who would do this to her? To them?" Henrik crouched beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We don't know yet," he admitted. "But we're going to find out." Back at the farmhouse, Ingrid greeted Christian cautiously, holding Ira close. The resemblance between the baby and the grieving man was undeniable. Christian's eyes softened as he looked at Ira, though pain still lingered in his gaze. "She looks like her mother," he murmured, reaching out hesitantly. Ingrid hesitated before allowing him to touch Ira's tiny hand. The baby cooed softly, seemingly unaware of the weight of the moment. "You'll stay here tonight," Henrik said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next." Christian nodded, though his expression remained haunted. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking care of her, for giving her a chance when no one else did." As the evening fell, the three of them sat together in the dimly lit kitchen, united by grief, hope, and an unspoken determination to uncover the truth. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of secrets yet to be revealed. Henrik glanced at the rifle leaning against the wall. Whoever had tried to silence Astrid and perhaps Era might still be watching. And if they were, Henrik vowed silently, they wouldn't get away with it. The morning sun filtered weakly through the windows of the Larson farmhouse, its golden light failing to chase away the cold weight pressing down on Christian's chest. He sat at the worn wooden table, elbows resting against the surface, fingers pressing into his temples. His body felt like it hadn't known rest in weeks. A child's soft murmur broke the silence. He looked up. Across the room, Ingrid sat in her rocking chair, holding Era close, his daughter. She was awake now, her tiny fingers wrapped around one of Ingrid's. So small, so unaware of the world that had nearly stolen her away. Christian exhaled, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to crumble. Not now. For the past few days, Christian had barely left Era's side. He had never imagined his introduction to fatherhood would be like this. His wife gone, his child nearly lost to him. But he refused to waste another second. He was learning Era's rhythms. The way she scrunched her nose when she was about to wake. The quiet gurgle she made when Ingrid hummed to her. The way her tiny hands reached out instinctively for warmth. And though she didn't yet recognize him, he would wait. He would earn his place in her life. Still, no amount of love could quiet the storm raging inside him. Someone had stolen Astrid's life. Someone had taken his child and left her to disappear, and he would find out who. Christian leaned forward, his fingers laced together. I need to hire someone. A private investigator. Henrik, seated across from him, nodded. A smart move. He paused, studying Christian carefully. But you'll need more than just an investigator. Whoever did this, they're dangerous. They silenced Astrid and tried to silence Era, too. Christian's jaw tightened. Then I'll do whatever it takes. Money isn't an issue. Henrik exchanged a glance with Ingrid, who was still cradling Era. We'll help however we can, Henrik said firmly. This isn't something you should face alone. Christian hesitated, then nodded. Thank you, both of you. His voice cracked slightly, but he cleared his throat. Without you, I might have lost her forever. Ingrid gave him a small, sad smile. She's safe now. That's what matters. Later that day, Christian returned to Skovbjerg village to meet with a private investigator recommended by the local shopkeeper. The man, Lars Jensen, was known for his sharp instincts and unyielding determination. When Christian arrived at Lars' modest office, he found the investigator already poring over documents and photographs spread across his desk. Mr. Nielsen, Lars greeted, standing to shake Christian's hand. I've heard about your case. It's unusual. Christian handed over the photograph of Astrid and Era. My wife is dead. My daughter survived. Someone wanted them both gone. Lars studied the photo, his brow furrowing. And you think there's a connection between their disappearance and her death? I know there is, Christian said firmly. Whoever took them, they didn't want Era to be found alive. Lars nodded slowly. All right, let's start digging. But I'll warn you, this won't be easy. People don't vanish without a trace unless someone powerful wants it that way. Christian clenched his fists. Then we dig deeper. Back at the farm, Henrik couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest surrounding their land seemed darker, heavier somehow, as if it carried secrets it didn't want uncovered. He stepped outside under the pretense of gathering firewood, but his eyes scanned the tree line instead. The wind howled through the branches, carrying whispers that sent chills down his spine. Something or someone was still out there. Henrik tightened his grip on the axe slung over his shoulder. If whoever had buried Astrid thought they could stay hidden, they were wrong. Inside the house, Christian held Era in his arms for the first time. Her tiny weight against his chest filled him with a mix of awe and sorrow. "You're safe now," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Daddy's here." Ingrid watched from the doorway, her heart breaking for the man who had lost so much. Yet there was strength in his voice, a promise to protect his daughter no matter the cost. Over the next few days, Lars uncovered fragments of information, rumors of a wealthy family in Copenhagen with ties to illegal adoptions, whispers of women disappearing from rural areas, and reports of abandoned children found near remote farms. Each clue led to more questions, but one name kept surfacing: Victor Nielsen. When Christian heard the name, his blood ran cold. "That's my father-in-law," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "He must have known something." Lars frowned. "If he's involved, tread carefully. Men like him don't leave loose ends." Christian's resolve hardened. He wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth, even if it meant confronting the man who had once been his ally. The truth unveiled. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves through the valley. Christian sat at the farmhouse table, one hand gripping a coffee cup he hadn't touched in over an hour. His mind raced, thoughts tangled with grief and fury. 2 weeks ago, he had been a husband searching for his family. Now he was a widower uncovering the truth. And the truth was ugly. His phone buzzed against the wooden table. Mark Bennett's name flashed across the screen. Christian exhaled slowly before answering. "Tell me you have something." Bennett didn't waste time. "I found out who ordered it." Christian stiffened. Ordered it. Not just a random act of violence, not just a robbery gone wrong. Someone had planned this. Bennett's voice was flat. "Daniel Singh." For a moment, Christian thought he had misheard. His breath came sharp, like the air had been knocked from his chest. "Daniel?" "Yes." Christian shot to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor. Henrik, who had been feeding the chickens outside, glanced toward the house, sensing the shift in energy. Bennett continued. "Your former CEO fired last year for embezzlement. It wasn't just a few missing dollars either. He lost millions. And when the board pushed him out, he lost everything." Christian swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. "What does this have to do with Astrid?" A long pause, then. His wife was pregnant at the time. A sick, cold realization settled in his stomach. Bennett's voice darkened. "She miscarried a few days after Daniel was fired." Christian clenched his fists, the pieces clicking into place. Daniel had been spiraling for months before his firing. The man had once been charming, respected, a smooth talker with the board, a ruthless businessman in the corporate world. But Christian had seen through him. He had seen the reckless spending, the forged accounts, the siphoning of company funds. Christian had been the one to expose him, and Daniel had lost everything: his career, his wealth, his child. And in his twisted, broken mind, he had decided that Christian needed to lose the same. Bennett's voice was tight. Astrid and Ira were never supposed to die. Christian felt sick. What? The plan wasn't to kill them. Singh just wanted to take them, make you suffer like he did. But the men he hired, Bennett hesitated. They weren't professionals. They were violent. Christian's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Astrid fought back, Bennett continued. She must have realized what was happening and ran. She tried to escape with Era. She almost made it, Christian. Almost. But they caught her. And when she resisted, when she fought for her life and her child's, they killed her. Christian's vision blurred, his breath coming in uneven bursts. His wife had died alone in the woods, bleeding out in the dirt, her last act to save their daughter. He squeezed his eyes shut. His nails dug into his palms so hard they left half-moons in his skin. "Christian." Bennett's voice was softer now, but firm. "I know where Daniel is." Christian inhaled sharply. "Where?" "Copenhagen. He's laying low, but he's not hiding. He doesn't think anyone will connect him to this." A pause. "We can fix that." That night, Christian sat outside the farmhouse, staring at the vast, open land before him. Henrik joined him, lowering himself onto the wooden steps. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Henrik sighed. "You found him, didn't you?" Christian didn't answer right away. His jaw was tight, his hands gripping his knees. "I know who did it." His voice was controlled, but there was something beneath it. A storm barely held at bay. Henrik nodded slowly. He wasn't a man who pried, but he had seen that look before, a man standing at the edge of something dark. "You gonna let the police handle it?" Henrik asked, though he already knew the answer. Christian exhaled harshly, shaking his head. "You think a man like Daniel Singh leaves loose ends?" Henrik leaned back against the railing, studying the younger man. He had seen many kinds of men in his life, but the ones who carried the weight of loss, the ones who had nothing left to lose, were the most dangerous of all. "Just don't lose yourself in this," Henrik said finally. Christian didn't reply. He had already lost everything that mattered. And now it was Daniel's turn. The Copenhagen courthouse loomed over the city, its grand stone facade standing as a silent witness to the justice sought within its walls. The wind carried the scent of damp pavement and autumn leaves, but inside the courtroom the air was thick with tension. Christian sat at the prosecution's table, his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. This was it. Henrik sat beside him, his presence steady and grounding. Across the room, Daniel Singh stood flanked by his lawyers, his expression smug, as if he believed he was untouchable. When the judge called the court to order, Christian rose to his feet. His voice was calm but laced with steel as he began recounting the events that had led him here. The betrayal, the loss, the unbearable grief. As Christian spoke, Daniel's confidence began to waver. For the first time, the man looked uncertain, even afraid. By the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. Guilty on all counts. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, Christian took a deep breath, the weight of vengeance lifting slightly. But he knew the real healing would come later, back home, with Era in his arms. Henrik placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, son." Christian nodded, looking toward the horizon. "Now we rebuild." The years passed in the quiet way that only time and love could allow. 5 winters came and went, each one bringing new laughter, new moments of peace. The Larson farmhouse, once a place of quiet routine, had become something more. It was a home, not just for Henrik and Ingrid, but for Era and in some ways even for Christian. She was 5 now, a bright and lively child, her laughter filling the halls, her small feet pattering against the wooden floors. She called Henrik and Ingrid Farfar, Grandpa, and Farmer, Grandma. The words had come naturally, unforced, a bond that had grown over time like the strongest roots of an old oak tree. Christian had never asked them to take on that role. They had simply become family. Christian still lived in Copenhagen, but the city no longer felt like home. His business had slowly resumed, but his priorities had shifted. Money and power, once so consuming, meant nothing compared to Era. Every few weeks he would make the long drive back to the farmhouse, where his daughter would run to him, her small arms wrapping around his legs, her excitement uncontained. "Daddy! Daddy!" she'd call, and Christian's heart would swell every time. Ingrid would shake her head and smile as she wiped her hands on her apron. Henrik would grunt, pretending he wasn't touched, though Christian knew better. Even after all this time, Henrik still watched over Era like a silent guardian, as if the weight of that stormy night 5 years ago had never truly left him. And perhaps, in some ways, it hadn't. Astrid was still there, woven into the fabric of their lives in ways both small and profound. Era had her eyes, those deep brown pools full of wonder. She had her kindness, too, always eager to help, always offering her hand, even to strangers. Some nights, Christian would sit by the fire with Henrik, a glass of whiskey between them, and the conversation would drift. She would have been proud of her, Christian murmured once, staring into the flames. Henrik nodded, slow and thoughtful. She already is. It was easier to believe that now. On the anniversary of Astrid's passing, Christian and Era always visited the hill. The grave wasn't lonely anymore. Flowers grew around it, planted by Ingrid's careful hands. A small wooden bench sat nearby, where Christian often sat while Era picked wildflowers and placed them against the headstone. She knew, in the way that children understood things without being told, that her mother had loved her. One afternoon, she turned to Christian, a small bouquet in her hand, and asked, "Do you think Mama can see us?" Christian swallowed, his chest tightening. He knelt down beside her, brushing her soft curls from her face. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "I think she sees us every day." Era smiled, satisfied with that answer. She placed the flowers gently beside the grave, then skipped back toward the farmhouse, her tiny figure glowing in the late afternoon sun. Christian stayed behind for a moment longer, his fingers brushing against the engraved letters of Astrid's name. He had kept his promise. Era was safe. She was loved. And no matter how much time passed, Astrid would always be with them. As the evening settled over the land, Christian stood on the farmhouse porch, watching Era chase fireflies in the yard. Henrik rocked slowly in his chair, a quiet contentment in his expression. Ingrid was inside, setting the table, humming softly to herself. For so long, Christian had thought revenge would bring him peace. But standing here now, surrounded by the people who had become his family, he realized the truth. Peace wasn't about justice or vengeance. It was about love, about holding on to the good memories while letting go of the pain. It was about building a future for Era, a future filled with laughter, warmth, and the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds. Henrik spoke suddenly, breaking the silence. "You did good, son." Christian looked at him, surprised. Then he smiled faintly. "We all did." Henrik nodded, his gaze drifting to Era, who was now spinning in circles under the starlit sky, giggling uncontrollably. "She's got her mother's spirit," he said gruffly. Christian chuckled softly. "Yeah, she does." Ingrid stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dinner's ready," she announced, her voice warm. Christian glanced at her, then at Henrik, and finally at Era, who was now running toward them, her arms outstretched. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging, of wholeness. As they gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter, Christian knew one thing for certain. Astrid might be gone, but her legacy lived on, in Era, in the love they shared, and in the life they had built together. And for the first time in a long time, Christian felt like he could finally move forward. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves as Christian and Era walked up the familiar hill. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the fields, stretching their shadows long against the earth. Era, now 6, walked beside her father, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. In her other hand, she held a small bouquet of fresh flowers, daisies, lilies, and a single rose carefully picked from the farmhouse garden. Christian exhaled slowly as they reached the headstone. Astrid Nielsen. For years he had stood here in silence, aching with loss, weighed down by grief. But now there was something lighter in the air. Not absence, not sorrow, but presence. Era knelt down, arranging the flowers neatly against the stone. "Hi, Mama," she said softly, smoothing the petals. "I miss you." Christian's throat tightened. "She loved that," he murmured, kneeling beside her, brushing a few fallen leaves away. Era tilted her head, thoughtful. "Do you think she misses me, too?" Christian smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Every day, sweetheart." Era nodded, satisfied, then glanced up at him. Her dark eyes, Astrid's eyes, studied him with quiet curiosity. "Daddy," she said, her voice unusually serious, "are you lonely?" Christian stilled. It wasn't a question he had expected. For a long time the answer had been yes. Painfully, overwhelmingly yes. But now, he looked down at her tiny fingers tracing the edge of the gravestone, at the way she always carried love so easily. "No," he said honestly, "not anymore." Era smiled then, her small hands reaching for it. She didn't ask anything more. Some things she already understood. That evening, back at the farmhouse, the smell of home-cooked food drifted through the air. Henrik sat on the porch, rocking slowly, while Ingrid stood at the stove, humming a soft tune. It was a picture of warmth, of home. Christian sat beside Henrik, watching Era chase the last flickers of daylight across the yard. Henrik, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke. "You know," he said, his voice gruff but gentle, "she's getting older. She'll need to go to school soon." Christian nodded. He had been thinking about it for a while now. Era couldn't stay tucked away in this quiet countryside forever. Henrik leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You ever thought about bringing her home to Copenhagen?" Christian looked out at the fields, at the only home Era had ever known. "I have," he admitted. "But I won't force her." Henrik hummed in approval. As if sensing their conversation, Era suddenly ran up the steps, panting, her cheeks flushed from play. "Farfar!" she chirped, throwing her arms around Henrik's legs. Henrik chuckled, patting her head. "What's got you so excited?" Era pulled back, glancing between the two men. "I know where I want to go." Christian raised a brow. "Go where, sweetheart?" She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "I love it here," she said slowly. "I love Farmore and Farfar. I love our home." Henrik smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. "But," Era's gaze flickered to Christian, "when I turn 6 and I have to go to school, I want to go to Copenhagen with you, Daddy." Christian felt something tighten in his chest. Era continued, her voice firm but sweet. "I want to see where you live. I want to go to school there, but—" She turned to Henrik and Ingrid, her lips curling into a smile. "I'll visit all the time. I promise." Ingrid, who had been listening from the doorway, placed a hand over her heart. "Oh, sweetheart." Henrik only nodded, as if he had already known what she would say. "You've got a home here whenever you want, little one." Era beamed, turning back to Christian. "Is that okay, Daddy?" Christian swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you decide." Era's arms wrapped around him in an instant, her small body pressing against his. And just like that, the decision was made. A new chapter was beginning. As the sky darkened, the family sat together at the dinner table, laughter filling the space between them. The scent of fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and warm cider mingled in the air, wrapping around them like a familiar embrace. Christian watched Era chatter excitedly about her plans for school, about the things she wanted to do, about the future that lay ahead of her. He glanced at Henrik and Ingrid. At the people who had given his daughter a home when she had nowhere else to go. He met Henrik's gaze and silently, gratefully, nodded. Henrik only grunted, cutting into his roast. But there was understanding in his eyes, and Christian knew he would never be alone again. A week later, Christian and Ira stood at the hill one last time before heading back to Copenhagen. Ira laid fresh flowers against the headstone, carefully, gently, like she always did. Christian knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her small shoulders. "We'll be back soon," he promised. Ira nodded. "Bye, Mom." She reached for Christian's hand as they walked down the hill, back toward the farmhouse, back toward the future. The sky glowed golden. The scent of home-cooked food drifted from Ingrid's kitchen. Love remained. Life moved forward. And at last, they were ready. If this story touched your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to Timeline Stories to explore more meaningful stories with us. If you enjoyed this tale, now we'd love to hear from you. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories and comments. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can connect and grow. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.